I will introduce all participants and then we will go in that order through the presentations. Our first presenter today is Jerome Bias. Jerome Bias is a native of Halifax County, North Carolina. He is a furniture maker who builds furniture using only the tools and techniques that his 18th century ancestors would have used. He has a passion for Southern furniture with a focus on the life and work of the 19th century free black cabinet maker Thomas Day. As a member of the Slave Dwelling Project team, Jerome travels around the country, bringing the lives of the enslaved into focus by visiting slave dwellings. In those very same spaces, Jerome cooks the food of the enslaved over open fires as they once did. Jerome has recently been recognized by North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper for his efforts to preserve the history and culture of the great state of North Carolina. Our second presenter today is John U. Rees. John U. Rees is the author of They Were Good Soldiers, African Americans Serving in the Continental Army, 1775 to 1783. John has been writing about the common soldier's experiences in the War for American Independence for over 30 years on subjects ranging from Army food and the soldier's burden to women and with the Army, campaign shelter, wagons, and watercraft. Our third presenter is Frank McMahon. Frank McMahon is an interpreter at historic Halifax State Historic Site and has served with the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources for over 6 years. Frank holds a Master of Science in Park and Resource Management from Slippery Rock University of Pennsylvania and a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He has previously served as an archaeologist at Apache Sitgreaves National Forest and as an interpretive ranger at Valley Forge National Historical Park. Dr. Leslie McKesson, Dr. Leslie Dula McKesson was appointed to the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, a division of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources in 2019. She is a retired educator and administrator with more than 28 years of service to the North Carolina Community College system. Her current professional pursuits include serving as an adjunct university professor, providing contract services as an equity specialist, and serving on several nonprofit boards related to history and racial equity. Dr. McKesson serves as our moderator for today's discussion. We will begin with the three presentations, and then that will be followed by our question and answer and discussion period. And then Frank will have a wrap up for us at the end. So Jerome, I will turn it over to you to begin the presentations.
Thank you very much. Let me take a moment to get my PowerPoint on screen here. So it's going to take a quick second, and then I'll begin. Let's see, all the magic buttons to push. There we go. Oh, there you go. All right. All right. My name is Jerome Bias. Thank you for having me here today. Today, I would like to talk a little bit about the people who are not able to self-emancipate themselves. Often when we talk about the enslaved, we end up focusing on the enslavers. We ask the questions such as how many enslaved people were owned, how little food rations were given out, how little clothing was given. In many ways, we're focusing on what the enslaver doing to the enslaved population. I would like to take a moment to ask the question of who were these folks who did not self-emancipate? How can we view them? What might liberty look like for them? In the first part of my presentation, I would like to look at who were these folks who remained on the plantation and examine how we can view them by examining the life and tasks of an enslaved cook. In the second part of my presentation, I'm going to look at some of the ways that people created liberty for themselves while still enslaved. I would like to note that the picture shown on the right of this slide is a ceramic picture that was found in an archaeological digs at Montpelier Plantation, and it was found among in the slave quarters. The item here we know it did not come from the the manor house that actually came from something the enslaved population had bought. Often when we think of the enslaved population, we see them as being engaged primarily in agricultural activities. In fact, they were engaged in all the trades that were needed to make a town or plantation functional. They were potters, dressmakers, seamstresses, brick masons, plasterers, barrel makers, house builders, shoemakers, just to name a few of the trades in which they worked. This slave broadside advertises the sale of a number of enslaved individuals who are practicing various trades. Most notable are Margaret and Sylvia, both of whom were cooks. Cooks were skilled tradespeople. They were often trained and when an enslaved person was auctioned off, they commanded a premium price. That price was often dependent upon the training which that person had. Let's see. I have to move one thing on my screen here because it looks kind of odd. Sorry, please. There we go. All right. So you might notice that Sylvia here is described as just a plain cook and washer, while on the other hand, Margaret's a house servant and cook. More than likely, Margaret would have brought a higher premium, which came time for auction. I'd like to consider the role of the enslaved cook for President James Madison and his wife, Dolly. Dolly Madison was known as a hostess with the mostest. She was known for dinner parties, barbecues, and Southern hospitality. She routinely had 12 to 25 relatives and guests staying in their plantation home, Montpelier. As one of the richest women in the state of Virginia and the wife of a president, Dolly Madison was more than likely not cooking the food. Dolly was known for serving 3 hearty meals a day. Most certainly, she was not cooking those meals, her enslaved cook was. If either Sylvia or Margaret was charged with being the head cook for Margaret, their duties would be quite extensive. They would extend far beyond just cooking and bringing hot meals, dishes of food to the table. Besides having to be an exacting manager of people, gardens, and food supplies, she would have to be extremely adept to the rules of white society. She would have to be able to give her owners, the illusion of being in control of the kitchen, while in fact she was. Somehow this does not fit the historical stereotype of the personality and person who was the enslaved cook. It seems more fitting to me to see the enslaved cook as perhaps a type A personality, a person who was exacting while being a supreme manager of people and materials. She had a lot to manage, and I suspect she did not have time for foolishness. She was an agile social diplomat, but she did not play. Now that we've taken a moment to look at who some of the enslaved people were, let's look at what ways that they created a bit of liberty for themselves. In the United States, we often express ourselves through the things that we buy to surround us. While there are precious old documentation on what the enslaved owned, there are a few documents that give us a glimpse. Some of those documents include store ledgers, account books, letters, court records, and runaway slave ads. Runaway slave ads are really great at describing what people were wearing, what kind of clothes they had, many of which they had procured for themselves. The second really interesting place that I find to gather information about what the enslaved owned are archaeological studies. Specifically archaeological digs that go around the slave quarters and then the trash deposits called middens around the slave quarters. It's amazing what you can find about people when you dig through their trash. One document that I found really incredibly interesting is this page on the right-hand side. This is a section of a store ledger from historic Stagville in Durham, North Carolina. And in this document, you can see that old Frank, who's an enslaved person, in 1810 buys a number of items from the community store, amongst which is 5 yards of calico. Now, the total bill for everything that Frank buys is a little over 3 pounds. So you find yourself asking the question, just how did Frank pay for this money, pay for these goods? He's working on this plantation, he's living on this plantation, he's owned by this plantation, but he's not getting paid for his labor. How is he doing this? Well, he pays his bill by chopping 15 cores of wood. That is at least 15 pickup truck loads of wood that he had to cut and split after he had worked a full day's work from sunrise to sunset. No doubt the purchases he made were of great value. Did he buy the calico for his mom, for his daughter, or perhaps he bought it for someone else that he loved? Sometimes I find myself wondering that if a dress was made from this fabric, what might it have looked like? As you know, calico is not a boring, drab, black and white fabric. Perhaps it looked like this dress indeed here. These are pottery sherds from the archaeological study of a slave quarter in Montpelier. They do not. It should be noted that they don't match the dishes from the main manor house. They were not chipped hand-me-downs. I smile when I think that some enslaved person put an enormous amount of energy to enable themselves to buy a beautiful set of colored tea wares. And so we come back to Sarah. She's a reenactor and she's a friend of mine. She could have, in the 18th and 19th century, she could have easily been a proud enslaved woman who was enslaved on a plantation here in Halifax County. Her life would not have been easy. Her living conditions would not have been great. Running away would have meant losing her entire family. More than likely, her and her family had been on that plantation for multiple generations. She couldn't buy her freedom, she more likely couldn't buy her freedom or that of her children. But by making something out of nothing, she and her family were able to supply themselves with enough food to survive. And at times they were able to buy the occasional item that brought them the slightest bit of joy into their lives. Was it an ideal form of liberty? No, but it was a slight, at least a very slight form of liberty. Thank you. There we go. Next.
Thank you, Jerome.
Thank you.
And next we will hear from John Rees. John, you're on mute.
There we go. I didn't know I had to do that myself. Thank you very, very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it was really good to hear Jerome speak. Let me see if I can share my screen now. Let's see, there we go. Okay. In a short amount of time, I want to give you a whirlwind tour of Black Soldiers Revolutionary Service. Before I begin, I wanted to discuss this first slide. We have here a modern image of a single company of out of a total of 8 in Henley's additional regiment in 1779. Having only 16 privates is far below the called for complement of 53, not unusual in many regiments at the time. Still, there are 2 African Americans in the ranks. All said, this is a good representation of how many Continental companies would have appeared, with some having a few more Black soldiers and others having none at all. Now I want to turn to talking about the hows and whys of my book before I go into a further discussion. They Were Good Soldiers begins by discussing the inclusion and treatment of Black Americans by Crown commanders, focusing largely on British and Loyalist Corps, with some discussion of German units. The narrative then moves into an overview of Black soldiers in the Continental Army before examining their service state by state. Each state chapter looks first at the Continental regiments in that state's contingent throughout the war, and then adds interesting Black soldiers' pension narratives or portions thereof. The premise of this is to introduce the reader to the men's wartime duties and experiences. The book's concluding chapters examine veterans' post-war fortunes in a changing society and the effect of increasing racial bias in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. My intent from the start was to make extensive use of Black veterans' 19th century pension narratives. For those unfamiliar with the revolutionary pensions, they are by far the best way to hear the men's stories in as close to their own words as is possible, to almost hear them speak. Additionally, personal details available nowhere else are revealed by the veterans or those close to them. In essence, my wish is to present their experience as soldiers, as citizens, and as individuals, and pension narratives are the best way to accomplish that. Here are a few brief examples from those accounts. Veteran Caesar Shelton testified, before he enlisted, he was in the militia. He was wounded at Horse Neck Landing. He was just relieved from guard and had laid down with his pack on and fell asleep when he was awaked by an order, surrender. He jumped out of the window and escaped to the bushes, but received one blow with a cutlass across his back. He was also struck by a musket ball on the skin at the same time. Jim Capers of South Carolina was in the Battle of Eutaw Springs. At that battle, he received 4 wounds, 2 cuts upon the face, 1 on the head with a sword, and 1 with a ball which passed through his left side, killing the drummer immediately behind him. And in the early 19th century, Virginia Thomas Mahorny testified that he is a planter on a little farm not his, and is rendered unable to pursue it by reason of his age and infirmity. His family residing with him are as follows: his wife Maima and his son Jack, both of which are slaves. He, Thomas, being a free man of color who served in the War of the Revolution, is unassisted by the labor of his family. And now a few basic facts. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When those wars were made public in 1776, Africans had been enslaved in British North America for almost 160 years, and African Americans have been fighting 14 months for the cause of American independence in the Continental Army, Navy, and States Militia. Not for another 89 years would slavery in the United States be legally ended. At the onset of the War for Independence, approximately 500,000 African Americans lived in the colonies, of whom some 450,000 were enslaved. Blacks fought in provincial regiments prior to the war, and roughly 5,000 African American soldiers and sailors, free and slave, served the revolutionary cause. The American population at the time was approximately some 2.1 million, and free blacks comprised 2.4% of the overall population, and slaves formed 21.5%. The role of African Americans in the regiments of the Continental Army is not well known. Neither is the fact that relatively equal numbers served in both Northern and Southern regiments, and that the greatest number served alongside their white comrades in integrated units. The reasons Black soldiers enlisted in the Continental Army largely mirror those of their fellow white and Native American soldiers. Many fought for national independence and hoped for opportunities in the new country. Some, perhaps many, joined for the adventure of military service, sometimes connected with the prospect of serving alongside family or friends. Others were at least partly enticed by the lure of an enlistment bounty or regular pay. Forced service was another factor. If they were on the militia rolls, both white and Black men periodically faced the chance of being drafted for a short-term stint in a Continental regiment. Whites were occasionally compelled to enlist, but enslaved African Americans were more often coerced or forced by their masters to serve. Many, especially in New England, were promised freedom in return. Most of those promises were honored, but some veterans were kept in bondage post-war. Of course, the major dividing line between white and Black common soldiers was the American system that enslaved 90% of the country's African Americans. Because of that, and due to the revolutionary ideals espoused in the Declaration of Independence, for some of Black Americans, after 1776, the cause of personal freedom likely equaled or surpassed national independence. A number of American officers noted the fact of African Americans in the ranks, and early on some claimed they were unsuited to be soldiers. But given the fact of Black soldiers' continued and able service, those arguments proved false. Here are some of the positive comments. Rated in 1775, Massachusetts General John Thomas was emphatic. In the regiments at Roxbury, and those would have been mostly New England regiments, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. In the regiments at Roxbury, the privates are equal to any that I served with last war. Very few old men, and in the ranks, very few boys. We have some Negroes, but I look on them in general equally serviceable with other men for fatigue and in action. Many of them have proved themselves brave. Foreign officers were also complimentary. In December 1777, a German officer wrote of the American Revolutionary Forces, "The Negro can take the field in his master's place. Hence you never see a regiment in which there are not a lot of Negroes, and there are well-built, strong, husky fellows among them." And Baron Ludwig von Closen, aide-de-camp to French General Rochambeau, wrote in July 1781, and this passage is remarkable just for the condition of the Continental Army, let alone the inclusion of Black soldiers. He wrote, "I had a chance to see the American Army man for man. It is really painful to see those brave men, almost naked with only some trousers and little linen jackets, most of them without stockings, but, would you believe it, very cheerful and healthy in appearance. It is incredible that soldiers composed of men of every age, even children of 15, of whites and blacks, unpaid and rather poorly fed, can march so fast and withstand fire so steadfastly. As for numbers close and claimed, a quarter of Washington's army were Negroes, merry, confident, and sturdy. And a side note here, Closon's claim of 25% is rather exaggerated, so it seems that the numbers of Black soldiers did increase in the war's later years. By 1781, they likely formed as much as 8 to 10% of the Continental Army. And we'll actually we'll look a little further into numbers and see what the percentage was in the Army in 1778. Here we have the August 1778 tally that was made of the number of Black soldiers in 15 brigades of General George Washington's main army. I found no record of why they decided to make this return, and I would love to actually know the reason. But for us, it's a real boon. You can see that it's a pretty good representation. You have northern and southern regiments and middle states regiments. The only ones not shown on this roll are the units from South Carolina Island and New Jersey. You can see that there were 755 African Americans in a force totaling almost 18,000 rank and file, making 4.2% of the whole. So if the percentages in 1781 were 8 to 10%, that's double or more than double of what they were in 1778. That's my estimate. I don't have any real knowledge of what the numbers were in 1781, but from what I know of the Army, and it just seems that the Black numbers must have increased. Now, while the 4.2% proportions may seem small, by themselves, soldiers of color would form 2 understrength regiments, each equal to or larger in size than most other serving Continental regiments. And now, to emphasize the service of soldiers in northern and southern regiments, funding for the middle states regiments, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, had many less Black soldiers in the ranks. The Pennsylvania regiments had almost none at all. Here we can see the 6 brigades reporting the highest proportions of Black soldiers in the 1778 return. So you can see the numbers are larger, and in some cases far larger than the 4.2% of the 15 brigade total. Parsons, Connecticut had 9.3%, Newlandsburg, Virginia had 8.5%, and the North Carolina Brigade had 6.5%. So from numbers, let's turn to women with the Army. And I do, in my book, I do have an appendix that covers African-American women serving with the Army, both as servants and also as women following the regiments. I want to read a portion of the only extant wartime letter from a Black Continental soldier to his wife, published for the first time in my book. To preface the letter, John Lyons was a Black soldier enlisted in the 5th Connecticut Regiment in March 1781 for 3 years. By his wife Judith's own testimony, they married in July 1781. She recalled, the next summer after I married, which was 1782, he sent for me to come to him. I think the place was called the Highlands. At that time, my husband was a waiter for Colonel Sherman, and while out the camp, I had the smallpox. If anybody's familiar with the smallpox, it's a horrible disease, and just the fact that she survived is pretty amazing. She continued, I think I stayed about 3 or 4 months. Mrs. Lyons noted in the pension application, my husband used to write to me when he was in the Army, and I have one of his letters now, which I give to the magistrate who takes this by deposition. It is dated November 11, 1781, and is in the handwriting of my husband. Now the letter. I take this opportunity to send to you, my dear and loving wife, to let you know that I am well and hoping these lines may find you and the children well. She was actually at home with 3 children. This is the 6th letter of mine, and I haven't received one. I belong to Colonel Isaac Sherman's regiment, Captain Rice's company. We lay at Fishkill now. I should be very glad if you would send me a letter, how you have lived this summer, and whether the house is done, and whether you killed that cow, or whether you have got another. I want to know all these things very much. I intend to come home this winter if I can, but I don't know if I can. If I could see you myself, then I could talk with you, my dear wife, as I like. I have seen hard times. I have lived 11 days with bread only. I remain your loving husband until death, John Lines. To close, former Private Henry Hallowell, a white veteran of the 5th Massachusetts Regiment, who gave this simple but fitting tribute to the African-American soldiers, free and slave, who served the revolutionary cause in a number of roles. He wrote, "In my company, there was 4 Negroes named Jephthah Ward, Job Upton, Douglas Middleton, and Pomp Simmons. Part of them called on me after their time was out. They were good soldiers." And if anyone's interested, you can actually access a list of online articles at that link, and my email is right there if you would want to contact me with any questions later too. And I'll just close with that's the contents of my book. I want to thank you very much. Let's see. Oops. All right, how do there we go. There we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And next we'll hear from Frank.
Hi, folks. My name is Frank McMahon. I'm one of the interpreters at Historic Halifax State Historic Site. I also put together a quick PowerPoint. Let's see if this works. All right. So let's see here. In 1758, Halifax was established on a bluff of the Roanoke River. Because it was navigable by ocean-going vessels, the town became a center for commerce and political power during the colonial period. Agriculture was the foundation of the economy, and enslaved labor was its backbone. The town of Halifax is best known today as the place where North Carolina first declared independence from Great Britain. Although the Halifax Resolves may have made North Carolina first in freedom, this early call for independence did not include freedom for Halifax's enslaved residents. No matter their legal status, African Americans would be inspired by the ideals and spirit of the American Revolution to pursue their own independence and liberation. Despite enslaved African Americans enduring physical bondage, their minds and spirits remained free. The terminology used in this talk reflects this freedom of spirit and will refer to escaping African Americans as freedom seekers, rather than escapees, fugitives, or runaways. Historic Halifax State Historic Site is a partner of the National Park Service Network to Freedom and uses the term freedom seekers to demonstrate what was in the heart of African Americans who acted to make liberty a reality. The 18th century economy of Halifax County, North Carolina, was based on plantation agriculture. Cash crops, including tobacco, hemp, and grain, much of the labor was provided by enslaved African Americans. Colonial population records are spotty, but it has been estimated that 41,000 enslaved African Americans lived in North Carolina in 1767. Tobacco production areas like Halifax tended to have high enslaved populations. Royal Governor William Tryon estimated the African American population of Eastern North Carolina to be 5 to 1 white person. In 1739, up to 100 enslaved individuals from plantations along the Stono River in South Carolina would attempt to seek freedom in Spanish-controlled Florida. Although the Stono Rebellion would be put down by local militia, its memory would still linger in the minds of plantation owners and royal governors on the eve of the American Revolution. Shortly after the first shots of the American Revolution took place on April 19th, 1775, in Lexington, Massachusetts, North Carolina Royal Governor Josiah Martin would abandon the governor's palace, often called Tryon's Palace in New Bern, and relocate his headquarters to Fort Johnson, modern-day Southport. Rumors and an intercepted letter suggested that Martin was contemplating supporting revolt amongst African Americans. In late July of 1775, Fort Johnson would be attacked by colonist militia, forcing Martin to flee the colony on a British warship. Also in the summer of 1775, liberty or death chanting mobs in Virginia would drive their royal governor, John Murray IV, Earl of Dunmore, to also flee his colony in a British ship. In November of 1775, Dunmore promised freedom to any enslaved or indentured servant that were willing to bear arms and join His Majesty's troops. On November 17th, 1775, the Virginia Gazette reported one freedom seeker's disappearance as part of a determined resolution to get liberty, as he conceived by flying to Lord Dunmore. Within months, Dunmore raised an army of about 300 enslaved and indentured laborers. This unit of African-American soldiers became known as the Ethiopian Regiment and would clash with Patriot militia at the Battle of Great Bridge. Period accounts suggest they were uniformed in an overshirt emblazoned with the motto, "Liberty to slaves." After the Battle of Great Bridge, the British would continue to offer hope for freedom seekers that served the crown, although most would serve in non-combat roles. And this image is Martin Trimble, and he is dressed as a member of Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. And this image is going to get used in a traveling exhibit that we're going to have on display in about a month here at Halifax also. Service to the crown did not necessarily guarantee liberty to all, but at least 3,000 newly freed African Americans were transported to Nova Scotia by the British at the end of the American Revolution. Pro-independence colonists were quick to suggest the royal governors were part of a conspiracy to undermine the plantation economy and encouraged many undecided North Carolinians to break ties with Great Britain. On April 12th of 1776, 83 delegates to North Carolina's 4th Provincial Congress met in Halifax and issued a set of resolutions that became known as the Halifax Resolves. The document listed several grievances against the British government and accused royal governors of, and that's Martin and Dunmore particularly, of protecting enslaved men who stained their hands in the blood of their masters. The Halifax Resolves also gave North Carolina delegates to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia permission to vote for independence. The Halifax Resolves is regarded as the first official action towards independence by any of the colonies. The first public reading of the Declaration of Independence in North Carolina would take place in Halifax on August 1st of 1776. The Halifax Resolves is still commemorated on the North Carolina state flag with the date April 12th, 1776 found on the flag. While and also here using the same picture that John used of Nick Johnson, while the British offered liberty for enslaved African Americans willing to serve the king, many free African Americans in North Carolina supported the cause for American independence. By the time of the first US Census in 1790, free Blacks would make up 3.2% of the population of Halifax County, North Carolina. Free Blacks had the right to vote and were required to serve in the state militia, both during the colonial period and under the first North Carolina state constitution that was ratified in Halifax in the fall of 1776. Many free Blacks would support the cause for American independence, and it has been estimated that at least 5,000 free African Americans served in the Continental Army and Navy and state militias throughout the American Revolution. Both the North Carolina militia and Continental Army were integrated during the American Revolution. According to an August 1778 report on the Continental Army troop strengths at White Plains, New York, African American soldiers made up 4.8% of the North Carolina Brigade. North Carolina's African American patriots would have known Halifax as a militia district muster ground, Continental Army supply depot, recruiting and discharge station, and a stop on the road to join General George Washington's army in the North. The British writer Thomas Day wrote in 1776, "If there be any object truly ridiculous in nature, it is the American patriot singing resolution of independency with one hand and with the other brandishing a whip over his affrighted slaves." American independence did not deliver life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for North Carolina's enslaved men, women, and children. The growth of America's tobacco, cotton, and rice industries led to stricter laws and harsher work conditions. During the post-war period, Halifax County's enslaved community grew considerably. According to the first United States Census in 1790, Halifax County recorded 6,506 enslaved men and women. By 1860, the number had risen to 10,349. Meanwhile, the population of free whites remained relatively static, around 6,000 to 7,000 individuals throughout this time. John Chavis is believed to have been born in Sussex County, Virginia, around 1766. He moved to Halifax, North Carolina, as an indentured servant to attorney James Milner. In December of 1778, Chavis enlisted in the Continental Army's 5th Virginia Regiment and served for the duration of the war. After the American Revolution, Chavis attended Liberty Hall Academy, now Washington and Lee University, and the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University. John Chavis is regarded as the first African-American Presbyterian minister in the United States. He would serve as a missionary to enslaved African-Americans in Virginia and North Carolina. Chavis would open an academy in Raleigh that served both Black and white students. In 1831, a revolt of enslaved African-Americans led by Nat Turner in Southampton County, Virginia, resulted in the death of over 50 whites. In response, North Carolina placed additional restrictions on enslaved and free Black people. New laws prevented free African Americans from voting, teaching, receiving an education, and meeting and ministering without the presence of white oversight. As a result, John Chavis was forced to close his academy and give up his work as a minister. In a March 10th, 1832 letter to his friend, US Senator Wiley P. Magnum, Chavis argued that he had earned the right to be treated equally. And he would write, "Tell them, if I am Black, I am free-born American and a revolutionary soldier, and therefore ought not be thrown entirely out of the scale of notice." And this bust of John Chavis is on display at Washington and Lee University. We're going to be using an image of this in our exhibit that'll be here at Halifax. Many enslaved African Americans would seek their own independence on what would become known as the Underground Railroad. Halifax's location on a major south and north road system and the Roanoke River's access to ocean-going seaports made Halifax an important stop on this network to freedom. Free people of color often aided freedom seekers by concealing them, forging passes and securing their passage on vessels bound for larger ports or free states. Escape on the Underground Railroad was illegal and fraught with danger. Many freedom seekers would only taste freedom for a short time before being apprehended and returned to enslavement. The following account comes to us from James Williams on his journey through Halifax in 1838. The thought of being made a slave and of suffering the horrible punishment of a runaway restrained me. I lay in the woods all day without food. The next evening, I soon found a large pile of excellent apples, from which I supplied myself. The next evening, I reached Halifax Courthouse, and then I knew I was near Virginia. On the 7th of October, I came to the Roanoke and crossed it in the midst of a violent storm of rain and thunder. The current ran so furiously that I was carried down with it, and with great difficulty, and in a state of complete exhaustion, reached the opposite shore. James Williams' quest for liberty would eventually carry him as far as Liverpool, England. Along the way, he would be aided by sympathetic American Indians, African Americans, and Caucasian abolitionists. For the freedom seeker, simply crossing the Mason-Dixon line into the free states of the North did not guarantee freedom from slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and 1850 made it a federal crime to aid and harbor freedom seekers throughout the United States. Many freedom seekers would have to travel as far as Canada or further to maintain their liberty. The irony of an American having to seek liberty in Canada or England was not lost upon the American Anti-Slavery Society when they published James Williams' freedom-seeking narrative, "Even the soil which is yet greener for the blood of the revolutionary sacrifice, the plains of Lexington and Saratoga, may not be trodden in safety by the scared and toil-worn fugitive from Southern slavery." The American Revolution's emphasis on resistance, equality, and unity shaped African Americans' ongoing fight for liberty and citizenship. Black North Carolinians used various methods in the struggle for independence. While some enslaved people chose to liberate themselves, others fought for their freedom through armed rebellion and military service. Enslaved and free African Americans risked their lives to obtain freedom for themselves and their kin. And let me pull up, we have a little sneak preview here of our, let me stop share and see if I can bring up image of our new exhibit. All right, so this is going to be a traveling exhibit. Can I zoom in on this? And so we'll be able to bring this to other museums and sort of share some of the knowledge of Historic Halifax State Historic Site with other places. Also, we'll probably be able to bring it to schools, and we're really excited about having this new exhibit at the site that sort of juxtaposes that mission statement of Historic Halifax State Historic Site that focuses on the Halifax Resolves and the American Revolution, but also the other story we tell of the Underground Railroad here at the site. And that concludes my talk for now. Why don't we open this up for the open conversation?
Yes, I'll turn it over now to Dr. Leslie McKesson.
Unmute here. Thank you, Carl. And thanks to our presenters this morning. This has been very informative, great information to take and try to package together. And I'm going to start out by throwing out just kind of my thread, I think, that I see connecting these very, very wonderfully presented presentations. And before we do that, I would like to say we're going to have the opportunity for you all to ask questions, and you can do it in a couple of ways. You know, if you want to come on screen, we can acknowledge you to come on screen. You can unmute and ask your questions. You could also, there's a little reactions button. If you look down at the very bottom of your Zoom page, if you click on that, there's an icon where you can raise your hand. We can try to acknowledge you that way. So take advantage of either of those approaches. You know, if you want to ask it yourself on screen, we'll be glad to have you do that. If you prefer to do it by chat, that's fine as well. So let me just throw out a little something to get the conversation started. I think what is settling in on me as I've listened to these presentations are a couple of things. One is the term that Jerome mentioned. It's called self-emancipation. And to me, that is just a very refreshing idea. It's a kind of a novel way, I think, to look at the lives of African Americans during the time of slavery. And I really appreciate that viewpoint that personifies them, that humanizes them. You know, you talked about this kitchen manager was probably a type A person. You know, she didn't take any mess. I love that because it brings such a reality to people that we have kind of caricatured throughout history. With the idea of self-emancipation, I kind of pose that against the idea presented of freedom in the Revolutionary War, you know, with the European search and quest for freedom from Great Britain, while still becoming ever more restrictive towards African Americans. Because as John mentioned, at the time of the Revolutionary War, there was some degree of parity, I guess you could say, in the treatment of Black soldiers, even Native American soldiers and white soldiers. But as they came to ask for pensions, they started to be treated differently. And certainly as time moved forward in history, you began to see stronger discrimination against African Americans. So while Europeans were moving toward freedom, it seems that African Americans were being pressed away from freedom. And that just dovetails so well, I think, with what Frank was discussing about the Halifax Resolve and the whole idea of North Carolina being first in freedom, while we were still carving out a country that marginalized another group of people. So all of that is just, in my mind, a way of kind of seeing these narratives as they are intertwining with each other. Do any of you have any response to that? Jerome, do you want to say anything more about the idea of self-emancipation? I think you're muted, Jerome. Yeah.
It's always find the unmute button. It doesn't move, but you can never find it. It's amazing that the folks are always caught in the position that in which they are in, and it's easy to. So people find themselves in the position in which they're in, and it's interesting to note how the level of emancipation, the level of restrictions increase over time, whether it be before the revolution, during the revolution, or after. People who were in the revolution, who enslaved Blacks who were in the American Revolution, who after revolution were able to vote, and then later can't. And it's kind of interesting, who are now considered non-citizens. It's always interesting. I find it interesting to watch how all these groups, whether they're enslaved or free or somewhere in between, are having to find new and unique creative ways to create a little bit of liberty for themselves. Whether it's like Thomas Day having to use the laws and rules of the United States, of the state of North Carolina, to create an illusion of liberty for himself, or making money in order to create a version of liberty for himself, or whether it's an enslaved person who's saying, I don't have much, I can't do much, I can't buy my family, but I'm gonna buy something a little pretty for myself. And that's gonna be that little edge of liberty that they can have. Yes.
Yeah, that's profound. That's profound to me. John, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I wish I wish there was a really good book that actually covered the subject of restrictions from the Revolutionary period, the increasing restrictions on, I mean, enslaved Blacks, I mean, you know, their lives were restricted entirely. And as Frank said, with the slave rebellions, you know, there were even more restrictions put on later, which is hard to believe considering they were already enslaved. But as far as free Blacks, I wish there was a really good book that actually showed the change in attitude and this change, or the increasing restrictions from the Revolutionary period all the way into like the 1830s, 1840s. I mean, not even mentioning, you know, Jim Crow laws, you know, post Civil War and all that, but before the Civil War, the increasing restrictions on free Blacks, because there is a change from the Revolutionary period into the early 19th century and into pre-Civil War years. Even I just pulled this out. Even one of the men that left a pension, he even by 1787, it was a Virginian named James Cooper. He was a free Black, and he, in his pension file, he included a pass. I mean, he was a free Black, but he at that time he was given a pass, and the pass says, State of Virginia, October 1787, the bearer James Cooper, mulatto free man, being desirous to travel to the states of Carolina and Georgia. It's recommended that he does pass unmolested so long as he behaves himself well. He being an old soldier in Buford's defeat, he served faithful, and it's illegible after that because it's torn. So even by 1787, he felt it necessary, or it was just common for him as a free Black to have a pass to travel. And that's just after the Revolution. You know, with the passing of the Constitution and the, you know, the 3/5 rule and the Constitution, the cementing of slavery in the southern states, with especially with the patent of the cotton gin and the increasing cotton manufacture, and restrictions just increased from then on. And we have no real good. You can find tidbits in different resources, but we have no real good timeline of how and why that changed. And I wish. I mean, I actually have Ibram Kendi's book here, which is stamped from the beginning, which I haven't read yet, and I want to see if he actually treats that in there. So maybe I'll finally find a good narrative of it. But it did happen. I just wish it was better understood.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, John. And Frank, I think the exhibit that you all have put together, I'm really excited to see that, and I'm even more excited that it's going to be a traveling exhibit. Maybe we can get it up in Morganton sometime. Just put in a bid early along. But I think it speaks to some of these very same things. You know, I think this exhibit is going to kind of present the rest of the story. The the story that we valorized about the Halifax Court, Halifax Resolve, and First in Freedom, but there was more. So I think that's going to be powerful, very powerful.
Yeah, we're very excited to have people see it, and we're very happy it can travel also. It'll
Yeah.
tell that story and also kind of create more awareness of Historic Halifax State Historic Site as well.
Good. I think we have a question here in the chat, question for John Rees. What accounts for the relatively high proportion of African Americans in the Connecticut regiments? Was there a significant number of African Americans in Connecticut? And this question comes from Alice.
There was a relatively large proportion of African Americans in the New England states as a whole. What exactly accounts for the large proportion? I really don't know. It's just that they felt compelled to enlist. If you look at Pennsylvania, that on that August 1778 return, one Pennsylvania brigade had no blacks, and the other brigade had 2 blacks, and New Jersey probably had maybe 10 to 15, maybe even 20 blacks for the entire war serving in their state line, and I think it was less than 20. So the middle states, even with a relatively sizable population of African Americans, didn't have the proportions that are shown in New England or in North Carolina and Virginia, which is actually pretty amazing. Like I said, I don't know what accounts for it. I really don't. But it's actually amazing to see. And in Massachusetts and Connecticut, it wasn't stipulated in the laws, but occasionally slaves did enlist, sometimes with the okay of their owners, and sometimes not. There's one case where an owner went to the regiment to claim his slave, and the officer said, "No, he's enlisted. You can have him when his enlistment's done, but no, he's a soldier now." But more often than not, the enslaved soldiers, when they enlisted, they were promised their freedom, and more often than not got it. At least in the New England regiments, Massachusetts and Connecticut especially. But I don't know what accounts for the large proportion. But again, like I said, it's mirrored by Virginia and North Carolina, which is significant there too. It is notable though that even though Virginia didn't necessarily free slaves who served automatically, and I think it was 1785 or so, they passed a law that would free slaves who had contributed to the revolutionary cause, and that wasn't just soldiers. They actually freed some slaves who served as soldiers, but they freed slaves who had served in the salt mines, because salt was an extremely, I mean, it was necessary for preserving food for the army. But it was considered actually a contribution to the cause. So they actually did have that act. I don't know how many slaves got their freedom that way, but I know that at least some did. There are these little points of light shining through, what becomes an increasingly sadder and darker period as regards, African American liberties, both free and of course the enslaved population. But these little points of light do shine through, and that's what I find so fascinating about the Revolutionary period and the period just after the Revolution. But thank you for the question. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a couple of hands raised. First, Jerome, and then we'll follow up with Robert Anthony. So Jerome, if you would address us, please.
Just a real quick one. It's real easy to focus on whether the government imposed new regulations or not regulations, or allowed freedom or not in response to people's service. It's easy to focus on that, but something we use the word self-emancipate. I think it's important to focus on the fact that what did these people choose to do? What were they choosing, and why were they choosing to do it? and that they were choosing and doing things for themselves, that they were active participants. They were actively doing something. That self aspect is very important to be noticed, and something that we often miss. And it's easy to be overshadowed by what restrictions were there and whether or not they were given their freedom or not when they served, or things of that sort. Yes, I just wanted to point out that self-emancipate is really important.
That's a great point, Jerome, and it reminds me of a term that I use a lot in my side of the world, which is agency. You know, you talk about the agency that individuals enact to control their own lives to the degree that they can. So that concept really resonates with me. Robert,
that's what I.
Can we let's let Robert come in right quick, John, and then
Yeah,
we'll
sure.
First, good morning, and thank you for the panelists and speakers for doing this. For the past 40 years, I've been a librarian at the University in Chapel Hill with the North Carolina collection. But before that, I was a Haligonian. I grew up in Halifax County, so this has special interest for me. Mr. Rees, I wonder if you have ever looked at the book American Slavery, American Freedom by Edmund Morgan. It came out in the 70s, and he focused on Virginia and the kind of paradox of the movement toward freedom and American independence as contrasted to enslavement of a sizable portion. It was well received at the time. I think some of his theses have been challenged a good bit by other historians in the years since then, but that's maybe one that you might want to look at. One of the things that libraries are doing a lot these days is digitizing materials. And I know that many of you have used a lot of that. I can tell just by some of your comments and some of the statistics and all, but we're doing a lot with newspapers. And I would encourage that if you haven't really explored the several newspaper sites for North Carolina newspapers, that you consider doing that. Unfortunately, because of the requirements of granting agencies, we have to present these in different locations rather than one single spot to go to. And that's a great frustration to researchers. From my department, we contributed over 1 million pages to newspapers.com, which is, of course, is a pay site, but the state libraries work together and have free access physically in the public libraries and academic libraries around the state for the North Carolina newspapers, not the entire newspapers.com collection. And there are over 1 million pages of North Carolina papers from the earliest papers on up, primarily to the 1920s. There are two other sites that are smaller, Chronicling America, which is a collaborative grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities Library of Congress. And we've put up over 460,000 pages of North Carolina newspapers through that. That you can look at other states, you can search across the country. You can you can Google or Bing or whatever, Chronicling America, and get access to it. There's a third site, the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center, where we're focusing on newspapers. And with that, when we get copyright waiver from the owners of those papers, we've gone beyond 1923, which is the cutoff date for public domain. I'm going on too long, but I just would encourage you to explore online what is available for research at home. And Professor McKesson, I went offline. I went off video several times to check my other computer to make sure we had your book.
Ah,
And, you may be interested that we do in my
good.
you may be interested, though, to know that Amazon has a copy offered for $902.
I know.
Yeah. So
Go figure.
Mr. Rees, we also have a copy of your book. So, please, I could confirm that we had those. So I'm going to mute myself. But again,
Okay.
thank you for doing this very much.
Thank you for those suggestions. I appreciate that.
Would you give the name of that last resource you mentioned, Robert? I got the Chronicling America, and then you mentioned one after that.
It's in North Carolina Digital Heritage Center,
Okay.
And that is again, a grant-funded project where we have digitized not just newspapers, but yearbooks, a lot of high school yearbooks and college yearbooks. It's funded by, I'm going into too much detail, but by a federal grant. And we work with local institutions, local public libraries and archives around the state. And I think we're up to like 277 partners.
Wow.
So they get the materials to us and we digitize and host for free. I'm speaking in the royal we. I have coworkers who have the technical skills to do that. I just brag about what they go do. So.
Oh, great. Thank you. That's phenomenal information. I'm taking notes for my own personal use too. Someone just typed in, I think Adrian typed in the link to Digital NC. So there we have that. Are there any other questions that people have right now? If not, I want to throw out just a generic question to all three of our presenters. Excuse me. The work that you're doing is important work. Why do you see it as important at this point? Is there what is the context in which you see your work as being important to the American conversation right now?
Well, I want to take a riff off of what Jerome said and what you yourself said. I haven't really actually thought of it in that way. I think I knew it, but I never really put it into words. But the African Americans who served during the Revolution, on both sides. I mean, there really weren't many African American soldiers on the British side or even the Loyalist forces, but there were some. But on both sides, it was all about agency, because they chose. I mean, on the British side, a number of enslaved people actually chose to leave, chose to emancipate themselves and go to the British, because that's where they saw freedom, that's where they saw opportunity. On the American side, you had thousands of African Americans who chose to serve for whatever reason. For whatever reason they chose to serve. So there was a lot of agency there, and that's why I'm really interested in lack of agency imposed from above after the war, because I see all this choice during the war, and I see it narrowing after the war, and I just think that really needs to be known. I mean, so many people still don't know about that service. When you see modern images of it's starting to change, but when you see modern images of like a picture of the Revolutionary Army, you often see no Black soldiers, no African Americans represented in those pictures. And something as simple as that needs to change, because if you go to the rising generations, they need to be able to look at even just images and see themselves in those images and see the truth of what their forebears did, because they weren't just slaves. They weren't just enslaved people back then. There were people who were actually making choices and for whatever side. And it just needs to get out. It really does.
Yeah, absolutely. Jerome, is your hand raised? Okay.
In response to your question, I find myself, in the past, I've worked in museums, working with the public, and I've often found that both children and adults, African American in particular, see their enslaved ancestors as victims. And in our discourse, we talk about what was done to them, how many were owned, how little food they were given, but we don't stop and say, we don't really stop and look at them and say, okay, these people, they didn't get much food. Why did they survive? How did they survive? And how they do all this work when they still ain't got no food? Well, the answer is that they raise their own food. They're doing things, we're not stopping to say, okay, this is how, giving ourselves a chance to stop and look at, this is how these people made choices to create liberty for themselves and create a world for themselves in the smallest bit. And to say, that's a big deal, a big, hairy deal.
Yeah.
We talk about, I smile, we think about, Mr. Anthony talked about archives. In the archives, we have listings for inventories. When the slave owners died, you take an inventory of everything that they had, that they own. You know, we never list, in those inventories, very rarely do you ever see the stuff in the slave cabins. Why? Because it ain't the slave owners. They didn't go get it. The enslaved, they had to do it. That's something we can be proud of. Something, I want to find something to give people just the smallest modicum of something to be proud of for their ancestors, to say they did something. They made a point of survival. They weren't in Central and South America where they enslaved, the Africans who were brought there died in massive numbers because they weren't able to take care of themselves. And so I'm here, my goal in many ways is to give a sense of not just the agency, but to give personality and humanity to these people.
Yeah.
To make it so that people can love their great-grandmother, their great-great-grandmother.
Yeah.
And why they should.
I love that.
No, some of these people really like some pretty dishes. I like my dishes.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. That's a deeper perspective, I think, going into the lives of our ancestors, some of our ancestors. Frank, do you have anything that you want to add to the why question? What is it that made the folks at Halifax decide this was something we wanted to delve into and create an exhibit about?
I think for me personally, it was being able to show that the African-American experience is not divorced from the American Revolution. I think oftentimes in history classes in school, it's kind of brushed over African-American involvement in the American Revolution. And this idea that, where some of these people that, the free African-Americans like John Chavis, who was, a member of the Continental Army, was voting and a leading figure in sort of early America. People like that have kind of, I never learned about people like that when I was going to school. And I think it's to be able to show, to me, it gives me hope for the American experiment even today. This idea that at the very beginning, there were African Americans and Caucasians that were working together for common causes, but also to be able to show how complicated things were as well. That everything, what liberty meant was something different depending on who you asked. And this idea of being able to show people in their time and place being able to achieve agency as well is, I think, is an important story that needs to get out.
Absolutely. And with that, I think, Frank, were you going to spend a little more time telling us more about the exhibit? Is that kind of the place where we are now?
Yeah, I was just gonna, kind of wrap things up with a little bit more about what we've got going on at the site currently. Basically, I wanted to, thank everyone for coming out today. It's been a real pleasure to have Jerome Bias, John Rees, and yourself, Dr. McKesson here. I want to give a special thanks to the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission and Freedom Roads Initiative for making Seeking Liberty in Halifax a success. And additionally, I'd like to invite everyone to come visit historic Halifax in the near future. Historic Halifax State Historic Site is committed to honoring the diverse struggle and experience of North Carolinians. Historic Halifax is funded by the state of North Carolina and preserves 8 historic buildings ranging from 1750 to 1850. Both the town of Halifax and the historic Halifax Underground Railroad Trail are recognized by the National Park Service as part of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. And we have a traveling exhibit on display right now at the site. It's a statue of Harriet Tubman. And I've got an image of it that I'm going to bring up for you to see. Let's see here. Okay, that is the Harriet Tubman exhibit that's on display right now at Halifax. It's going to be on display until April 18th. It's the Harriet Tubman Journey to Freedom exhibit. This bronze statue by North Carolina artist Wesley Wilfert depicts Harriet Tubman conducting a young girl to freedom. This is a temporary exhibit, but it will be on display until April 18th at Historic Halifax State Historic Site. Also, I encourage you all to find us on Facebook. On April 12th, be sure to visit the Historic Halifax Facebook page to learn how you can view we're going to be doing a virtual Halifax Resolves Day celebration. We're still trying to be mindful of COVID-19 restrictions here at the site and trying to limit any large gatherings, but the site is open 9 to 5, Tuesday through Saturday. It's free to visit. We do take donations, of course. And I just want to thank everyone for tuning in today. This has been great to talk to everyone.
Thanks so much, Frank.
Yeah, thank you,
And,
Leslie.
I'll point out too that a couple of comments have come through the chat that you might want to pay attention to. Jerome has given us reference to a book that you may want to look into for additional context. I think Adrienne may have sent us some information with some additional links. So there's lots of good stuff out there for scholars to pursue. And with that, I'll say thank you and turn it back over to Carl. Or
Carl has stepped out.
Okay.
So that was the conclusion.
Is that it?
For State
Okay.
Historic Site. Yeah, from me. But yeah, thank you. I mean, this has been great. I hope that we can do this again next year. And this is just a really great thing to be involved with. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
for the opportunity.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.